I think you could probably speak to this more authoritatively than I can, but my sense is that even in Catholic schools, since government funding has been extended to high schools, that what's happening in terms of the Catholic element in Catholic schools, Catholic education, and commitment to Roman Catholicism, it seems to me that all of that has been severely eroded in the last 2 decades, not necessarily as a consequence of the funding, but certainly I think that the funding and, as I say, the strings and expectations that are attached to that funding have had, I think, some negative impact on the education in Catholic schools.
You're quite right, and there's no arguing that the system has been watered down, where it used to be faith and education, where it's now mostly education with a little dash of politically correct faith. There's certain elements of the Catholic faith they just can't teach in school. And that's tragic, because that's, like any other mainstream religion, it's not a smorgasbord. You accept the teachings of the church or you reject them, but you can't go down the smorgasbord line and just pick and choose the parts you like and leave the other parts behind. That's not how the system works. But to get around the attachment to government funding, this is why I say vouchers, and leave the choice up to the parents. So the schools have to compete with each other in order to get those dollars. And if the parents don't like the way that a school is behaving, if it's teaching things it doesn't think are important, or leaving out things that parents think are important, then the parents ultimately carry the hammer. And they can say, well, I guess Johnny's not going back to that school. We'll go. And this would apply to any institution, regardless whether it's secular or religious. So if you had, let's say, a Jewish school, or if you had a Muslim school, or if you had, in this case, a Catholic school, you could choose any one of them. And it's all, they're all out there competing for those dollars. And you could even extend that out to high schools and universities and do the same thing. Because universities are heavily subsidized by the government. That's why tuitions, as high as they are not, are as high as they are, because they're so heavily subsidized. You want to see tuitions come down, take away the government subsidies, and those universities are going to have to get lean and mean and bring down, stop running courses that nobody wants, and making sure that the professors they have on tenure are of the highest possible quality. So it's a way to kind of take back the education system from the bureaucrats that run it now, which is why it'll never happen unless you have a really dedicated government. But I think that if you leave the voucher, like if the government says to a parent, okay, you have a voucher for X amount of dollars, and you decide, what's best for your family, whether what matters to you is how close your school is to home, because busing is an issue, or whether there's a faith element you want, or whether there's a academic level that you're after, or a gymnastics, a phys ed program in a particular school that might be famous for it. You can send your kids to any school you want to. That's not our concern. We're meeting our responsibilities under the Charter of Rights by allowing schools to be funded with public dollars. It doesn't say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, how that's supposed to be done. And this is why I'm a big fan of vouchers.
Well, we don't have a voucher system in Ontario right now. And in fact, even though there have been some experiments in voucher funding on a limited basis in some states in the United States, there hasn't actually been an across-the-board education system that is voucher centered, or that's run on vouchers yet, that I'm aware of. So I don't know, how we compare and contrast the two different systems. Certainly, from a theoretical point of view, I think that added competition between schools would be a good thing. I think you're right. I think that if you have a voucher system, that you will have, it's a way of getting around the funding issue. In other words, if every child has a voucher, and the funding for that child's education follows the child to whatever school he or she attends, that in itself, if the parents want the child to have Catholic education, then the Catholic school is going to be funded. But the actual funding direction in this case would come from the parents rather than the government. So I suspect that you're right, Nick. I think that would be one way to fund private denominational schools at the same time fulfill your requirement to fund Catholic schools pursuant to the Constitution. Just a quick comment, by the way, on the Constitution by way of information, Nick. It is possible, and has happened in this country, that you can have a bilateral constitutional amendment between a province where the constitutional mandate applies only in that province and the federal government. So in other words, the province of Ontario, where the funding for Catholic education in Ontario only applies to the Constitution as it applies to Ontario. So other provinces don't have the same requirement per se that Ontario has. They had similar requirements, but they've changed. They've amended the Constitution as it applies to them bilaterally. So Ontario could do the same thing. They could sit down with the federal government and they could say, let's amend the Constitution to remove this requirement as it applies to Ontario. And so long as Ontario agrees and the federal government agrees, then they could put it through. So, it doesn't quite, you don't get to the same level of a Charlottetown Accord or a Meech Lake Accord where you were actually dealing with constitutional amendments that affected all of the provinces. So you had to have agreement from all of the provinces on those amendments. So just a little bit of clarification on the constitutional aspect of it. But there is a middle ground here, and I'm not entirely, well, it does apply, I think it would be helpful to private denominational schools, and that is to say, if the government, both the provincial government and the federal government, were to recognize the value of education and the value of parents spending money out of their pockets, educating their children at an elementary and a secondary level, kindergarten to grade 12, rather than doing it through the public system, through the tax system, just sending their kids to school as they do now, and they pay a tuition. If the governments would recognize the value of that, at least to those parents, and gave them a proper tax benefit, proper tax receipts, number one, for that spending, so it's fully deductible, and I would even say that it's refundable. But that's a discussion to have. So there's that. And the second thing that you could do is, in terms of the education tax, parents who send their children to private schools, primarily to denominational schools, still pay, in addition to the tuition that they're paying, they still pay education taxes. And so, you're getting hit both ways. And this was a problem that we had when we were sending our children to Jewish school, was that we were sending them to Jewish school, we were paying for their education out of our own pockets, and not only were we not getting a tax deduction, but we were being taxed for maintaining the public education system that we were not having access to. And just two more very quick thoughts on that. The first is that, Nick, it's not true that the public education system is accessible to everybody. For various reasons, religious reasons, there are reasons why we want our children in a Jewish school as opposed to a public school. Public schools are really not non-denominational. they're secular. And I don't want to get into a discussion about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But whatever they are, they're not, public schools are not Jewish. Nor these days are they particularly Christian. So if I want my children to be raised in an environment that embraces and that respects their Jewish identity, then I'm going to want to send them to a Jewish school. And they can't have that in a public school system. And I'm not complaining. I'm just saying, all right, that's just the fact. And I've forgotten what my second point was.
It's okay. You'll remember it sooner or later.
Probably.
But this is why I like leaving the power, the dollars, in the hands of the parents. And yeah, you're right. There's a million ways to slice that pie. But ultimately, it comes down to what do parents want for their kids? And that's as individual as the families those children come from. So having, this is why I think that just like Lady Justice, Lady Education should be blindfolded and not worry about if someone is going to an accredited school, or even if they're not. There could be, if you want to have everybody meet standards, standards across the board, so a high school diploma means the same thing in Windsor as it does in Cornwall, then there's a set of standard testing at the end of grade 12 that they have to take. And if they pass it, then they get a government-issued diploma. If they don't, well, then they don't. So there's, I'm not necessarily sure I've thought that through. That's just off the top of my head. But to me, on the surface at least, it seems to make sense. That allows maximum flexibility within the education system for whatever school that you go to. Because I hear you when you're talking about, there's a certain culture. Religion isn't just, well, yes, it's a faith-based thing, but there's a culture that comes with that. There's a certain, look at it, you're going through Passover, we're going through Easter right now. Huge parts of our calendar years, probably the most significant for both faiths. And there's a culture that goes with that. It's not just, in our case, going into Mass or forward, that we would like our kids to appreciate and understand the significance of it, to embrace the different experiences we've had in the education system when we had at home, educating them at home versus educating them in the, let's call it, for just the Royal General education system, be it public or private. There were things about it we didn't like, so we said, we're coming home, but I pay taxes, just like you did, to send to fund the education system, even though I wasn't accessing it. It's like renting a car you're not allowed to drive, or renting a car that you don't. If you had a voucher, part of that, if the curriculum, and be well used that way. And homeschooling's not for everybody, I get that, but it's just another example of how these vouchers could be a huge boon to the education. Now, I can tell you right now who won't like this one little bit, and that's the teachers' unions. They are if some government came down the pike and said, guess what, we're going to let parents decide where their kids are going to go, the teachers' unions would hit the roof. They would not want anything to do with that, which tells me that that's probably the right way to go.
Okay, and speaking of the right way to go, it is now coming to the bottom of the hour, so we're going to have to take a quick break. So if you're listening to the show live, stay put. We'll be back in a few minutes. If you're listening to the podcast, thank you very much for joining us for this week's podcast, Part 1. Be sure to tune in for the next one, Part 2. And I guess that's all I have to say at the moment. So we'll be right back on the Nick and Joe Show on ThinkRadio.ca.